Good to see all of you back here again. Tonight we'll continue on, kind of where we left off, story of Luther, but we'll transition to talking about the Radical Reformation. Maybe we'll get Calvin in, I don't know. It depends on how quickly we get through this. I won't cross my fingers. I have prepared material for Calvin though, so we'll see. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about the Radical Reformation? Historians of the Reformation typically distinguish between what they call the magisterial reformers and then the radical reformers. And the magisterial reformers are the Reformed, or I guess you could say some of them would be in the Calvinist tradition. The Calvinism and the Reformed tradition are not identical with each other. Anglicans and then Lutherans. And what they're called magisterial is because they reform with the help of the magistrate. So the key about all of them is that they're all two things. One, they're Augustinian, so they all have a belief in that sin is incapacitating, and so a radical act of divine grace has to turn people around, okay? Though again, how that then plays out in terms of their sacramental theology and other things is different. And then they all think that the church and the state can be involved with one another, and it's perfectly legitimate for the state to, again, reform the church. Though again, there's different models there. As we'll see, Zwingli thinks the church and the state are kind of two wings of the same thing. Luther has the two-kingdom doctrine, but then functionally goes over to something like what's called Erastianism, which means the church basically becomes a subsidiary of the state. And that's how it worked in Germany and Scandinavia. And Anglicans are pretty officially committed to kind of Erastianism. Calvin has a very separatist model, but nevertheless, both think that it's okay for the church and state to be involved with one another. Then you get the radical reformers, and they reform, right, from our perspective, without the help of the magistrate. And so they are not infrequently viewed as rebels against the state. So there's going to be a lot of brutal martyrdoms going on. Though, of course, Catholics and Lutherans and Reformed people got martyred too. It's just this will be unrelenting martyrdom. Anyways. And also, so they're anti-Constantinian. They think that the state and the church should not be involved with one another at all. In fact, the church, to be authentic, has to not be involved in the state, is their conception. I think even American Lutherans would say, well, you know, we have a good deal in this society. You know, separation of church state has worked out pretty well. But the church isn't inauthentic, but somehow involved in the state. I mean, the Church of Norway has its own problems, but being involved in the state isn't one of them. But the Anabaptist tradition would say, no, that it makes it automatically inauthentic. And the fall of the church effectively happens when Constantine gets involved with Christianity. So in any case. So first let's talk about Luther and the spiritualists. So this will be Luther versus Karlstadt. Now Karlstadt is sort of in the Reformed camp, and he's also sort of in the spiritualist camp, but we'll see a little bit about this. So, last time we spoke, Luther is, of course, whisked away to the Wartburg Castle, gains a lot of weight, has an all-meat diet, which causes terrible gastrointestinal difficulties, and still thinks he's arguing with the devil. Famously, of course, you know, he threw the inkwell at the devil. Like, that probably didn't happen. And he writes a treatise called Against Latomus, so he also translates the New Testament from Greek into German. He uses Erasmus's translation, because Erasmus had the Greek on one page, and then he had the Latin on the other. And of course, Luther knew Latin a lot better than he did Greek. And so he was always having his eyes sort of on Erasmus's Latin version as he translated the Greek. And of course he went back and revised this, and he took suggestions from other people, and he constantly improved the translation until his actual death. Now, meanwhile, okay, so now he's also under imperial ban. He can be killed by anybody, and it won't be a crime. So, I mean, they don't have a police force, so that's kind of what you do, just allow kind of vigilante justice. So he's in hiding, okay, and then meanwhile, while he's at the Wartburg, other things go on in Wittenberg. So the radical reformers take over, specifically Karlstadt. Johann Andreas Thorstein von Karlstadt, okay, who was a Franconian who actually had a lot of really great degrees. He had a degree in canon law, he had degrees in theology, all kinds of wonderful degrees. He was very, very learned and very smart, but had a tendency of being a bit of a flake in some areas. He had a very bad memory, so whenever he would have debates, he'd get stacks of books and then make everybody wait while he looked things up if he was fighting against somebody. And of course, he was also very easily influenced to go over to something more like Radical Reformation. Now, technically, Melanchthon was supposed to be in charge. Melanchthon had shown up a few years earlier. He was the nephew of a guy named Reuchlin, who was a Hebrew scholar who had been the target of anti-Jewish attacks, not because he was himself a Jew, but because he thought studying Hebrew was good. People said, well, no, you have to study the Bible in Latin. That's how you really understand it. Language, of course, wasn't written in, of course. The chief person, of course, leading the charge is a guy named Pfefferkorn, who himself is a Jew, but converted to Catholicism. So, interestingly enough. So, by the way, it's not in the 16th century. It's not about race or ethnicity. It's about religion. So, the ethnic prejudice against the Jew, that's 19th century. Before then, it's religious, purely religious, and people converted to Christianity. They were perfectly fine. So, but anyways, perfectly fine in people's eyes. But anyways, Melanchthon's in charge, but he's born in 1497, and so he's 23, 24 years old, right? Already professor, right? So some of you have had college-age children or have college-age children. And I'm not certain you'd want to put them in charge of the Reformation. Anyways, so he didn't really know what to do. He knew how to teach Greek really well, but that was about it. He didn't really know how to run the Reformation, so to speak. And so he's sort of writing a lot of panicky letters to Luther because Karlstadt is tearing around town with the peasants and engaging in a campaign of iconoclasm. So they're all running around with them all. Okay. So meaning that they would go to churches and they would go and they knock the statues down of the saints and Jesus and all this sort of thing and say, well, the Old Testament says no images, so we're going to smash all the images. We'll smash the pictures of the Virgin Mary or the apostles or the other saints, and we'll destroy all the stained glass windows and things like this. And he participated in all this. He also had other ideas. Basically, in his view, anything that the medieval church did was bad. Okay, it's very similar to what will later be called the regulative principle of worship in the Reformed tradition, which is the idea that if the Bible doesn't explicitly say you can do it, then you can't do it. Okay, which then, I mean, how do you conduct a church service? I mean, some of them say, well, you can't sing hymns, you can only sing psalms. That's what the hardcore people do. But then what tune do you use for the psalm? There's no tunes in the Bible. The original tunes have been lost to us. So, well, you know, that's kind of that's wrong. I mean, they say that they celebrate the sacraments in the New Testament and sing hymns and things like that. But that's kind of not a lot to go on, right? So I think the regulative principle is kind of almost impossible. But for whatever reason, a lot of people find it very convincing. So one thing that he was really angry about was the elevation of the host during the Mass, because, possibly because it seems to suggest a kind of sacrificial action, though again, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. And in fact, Luther was going to get rid of it, but he says in his Against the Heavenly Prophets, well, I was going to get rid of it, but now that you say that we can't do it, then I'm going to keep it. But anyways. So he also refused to wear vestments, okay, and he believed so he also inverted the rule about clerical celibacy. It's now the responsibility of ministers to get married, and so he marries a 14-year-old and sets up a farm, and so forth. Luther liked the 14-year-old, and I thought it was probably the only good decision he ever really made. I thought they were very good for one another. Anyways, so... and beyond this, he also believes in a symbolic interpretation of the Lord's Supper. So he believes that when Jesus says, "This is my body," he was actually pointing at his own body. Okay? So this is when the symbolic interpretation of the Lord's Supper really starts getting off the ground. Now, as I mentioned last time, Amy Nelson Brunette, who's probably the most famous Reformation historian in the Missouri Synod that no one seems to have ever heard of, she says, she wrote a whole book about this, and she argues essentially that Luther encountered with Karlstadt about this issue. He always ended up associating rejection of the real presence as having to do with spiritualism and iconoclasm and this sort of demagoguery. And so that's one of the reasons why he was suspicious of sort of Zwingli and all of the Southern Reformers from the beginning. And his interactions with them were always colored, in her view, by the interactions with Karlstadt. So, in any case. So another thing that happens is that you have a group of spiritualists. Now, spiritualists are people who think that the Spirit speaks to them in their hearts. And this will really take off. Again, this is not a new idea. You have this idea in the Middle Ages with lots of popular uprisings and so forth. The Franciscans talked about the coming of the age of the Spirit that was supposed to start after 1260, right? And then, as we'll see, you have popular revolts. Well, the Franciscans the spiritual Franciscans had a radical offshoot from them called the Dulcinians. And the Dulcinians believed that that Francis was not only right that everyone should be, or that that poverty was an apostolic ideal, but that also meant you should kill the rich. So if you've seen that Sean Connery movie from the 80s, Name of the Rose, do you remember that? Okay, that's some of the heretics hiding out in the monastery of Dulcinians. That's what it's referring to. They followed a guy named Fra Dulce, who took over a mountain called Bald Mountain in northern Italy and then was going to attack the nobles. Figured the peasants would rally to him. Instead, they called in the cavalry, and who then end up slaughtering them. And they seem to have actually even practiced, they practiced communism of all kinds, including sexual communism. So a little bit off the reservation in terms of Orthodox Christianity, right? So anyways, but you have these folks now come out of the woodwork. The Zwickau prophets. Zwickau was a city also inhabited, as we'll see later on, by a fanatic named Thomas Munzer, okay, who would be one of the leaders of the Peasant War, who I'll mention passing later on. And they said, we don't need the Bible, we don't need any kind of intermediary with God. God speaks to us through our hearts. And they began to sort of prophesying about how the earth is going to be purified before the second coming of Christ, and so a campaign of kind of iconoclasm needs to start. They were also advocates of believers' baptism, right? So this is you have the beginnings of this idea that you get in the Anabaptist tradition and in the later Baptist tradition that the believer's baptism is the only way to go, because what is Christianity? It's a radical commitment, and so babies can't make radical commitments to stand over against the rest of society. So you've got to make the decision once you're old enough to be cognitive of it. So they're not related directly, of course, to modern Pentecostals, but again, you have the same kind of theology where the Spirit comes upon you, and then you don't really need the intermediary. Though modern Pentecostals are a little bit better than they are, since they would admit that the Bible is the Word of God. They just say that if the Spirit speaks to you, it has to kind of agree with what's in the Bible. So, of course, one wonders why the Spirit would need to speak to you anymore if everything you need is already in the Bible. So, if He does need to speak to you and give you a little bit of information, it obviously is not what you find in the Bible. But if He tells you exactly what you found in the Bible, then why the prophecy? So that's kind of a point for a lot of people. Okay, so eventually, against everybody's wishes, Luther eventually comes back. He keeps on hearing reports about how badly everything is going, and he says, "I've got to come back and fix things." And people say, "No, you're going to get arrested. Things are." You got to stay in hiding. And he says, no, I'm going back. I'm gonna set everything right. So he shows up, and he puts on his, though he's not in the monastery anymore, and he let his hair grow out, he puts on his monk's cowl, appears in public dressed this way, to prove to them that it's okay to dress this way, if that's what you want to do. There's no divine rule that you can't do it. And then he says to them, I'm going to just preach law to you, and I'm not going to preach anything but law to you until you guys shape up. So he preaches a series of sermons saying that God is not a God of disorder. He doesn't like attacks on church buildings. He doesn't like riots, and then sets everything straight. He also writes a book called Against the Heavenly Prophets, actually a very lengthy book, which becomes in many ways some of the basis for his response to both the later Anabaptists and also the Reformed tradition. So he makes several points about some of the things that have been going on. So first of all, he makes the point that the Bible is okay with images, right? Certainly you have the commandment not to make graven images, but the point of that is, don't, worship a statue or something like that. It doesn't mean you can't have pictures of Jesus and the apostles and things like this. After all, he points out, you have a bunch of images in the tabernacle and the temple, right? I mean, you have there's images of bulls under the basin and all that sort of thing. So images in and of themselves are not necessarily bad. In fact, he points out, he kind of using a Greek conception of human cognition. In Greek philosophical conceptions, cognition is a form of vision, it's a kind of intellectual vision. And he says, well, then if you can't think about Christian doctrine if you don't have cognitive images of different doctrinal concepts, and so, and those are images which point beyond themselves to God, so that's obviously must be okay as well. Otherwise, you couldn't think about God at all. So, secondly, he says the Spirit doesn't speak through people apart from the Word. Okay. He had a lengthened question of the Zwickau prophets, and he says, well, ask them this. The Old Testament prophets, they oftentimes felt abandoned by God. The psalmists felt abandoned by God. They felt the condemnation of the law. Ask them if they ever feel like that, or it's just all cupcakes and rainbows. And Melanchthon went to them, and they said, oh, yes, well, it's all just cupcakes and rainbows. And Luther said, well, they're not authentic then. So the Spirit only comes through the Word. Now, Luther was not very careful about this early in his career either. He would oftentimes talk about himself as being almost divinely inspired. So, but he realizes how kind of destructive that kind of thinking is at this point. And he says, the Spirit only comes through the Word and the sacraments. So that's how you get the Spirit. Even if you look at the prophets of the Old Testament, Elijah Elijah, for example, was inspired by the Spirit, but he knew God first. He received the Spirit first through God audibly speaking to him and through receiving the books of Moses as well. Yeah, go ahead.
What's being classified as through the Word? Is it just that, literally directly speaking Scripture, or is it, or what?
The content of Scripture.
Okay.
So when the pastor preaches to you the content of Scripture, the Spirit works through that as well. So, good question. Yeah. Right. So the Spirit only comes through the Word. So the Spirit doesn't rush on people and then they get information. This is it. He calls this enthusiasm or God withinism. That's literally what it means. And he tidies up his doctrine of the Word as a result of all this. Now you can see the connection here between this particular view of Revelation and then the anti-sacramentalism that you get with Karlstadt, and then the iconoclasm, rather. If the Spirit can come upon you without any kind of created medium, right, then you're always looking past the created medium to spiritual things. So at best, physical things can only point you beyond themselves to something spiritual, right? So, and Luther thinks that that's a really kind of poisonous idea. We'll see this in his Christology, and we'll see this in his view of sin as well. He doesn't think of sin in the way that Augustine thinks as a kind of downward movement. Augustine thinks, we should be focused on spiritual things, and the problem with what happened in the Garden of Eden is that we, got dragged down, so we became sensual and interested in the created order. We really should be focused on the spiritual world. Luther thinks it's the other way around. He thinks it's an upward revolt. One Lutheran theologian called it an upward revolt. Because in other words, we're getting away from we want to be like God. We want to move into the spiritual world. We want to get away from the physical and away from being creaturely, and that's exactly where we should be. So you can notice this too in freedom of the Christian. So what does then justification do for us? Well, it sends us back to creation, right? He says, well, we're going to be Adam and Eve all over again, okay? We're going to tend the garden, okay? We're not going to be elevated, ascend up into the heavenly realms. This is something you get in the monastic orders in the Middle Ages. They say, well, we're living like the angels already, because, the angels don't marry or are given in marriage, and, we're living this life, this pure spiritual life, right? So that's the kind of Augustinian ideal. And this is, of course, why Augustine, when he becomes a Christian, says, well, I may have had this 15-year relationship with this woman and have a son with her, but my goodness, I'm not going to get married. I'm going to go off and be, celibate, right? So, whereas Luther thinks that he has to get married, essentially, right? So it's the opposite direction. So Augustine thinks that he has to not get married to be a real Christian, okay? And Augustine thinks Luther thinks he does have to get married. So that's interesting. So God is to be found deep in physical things in the flesh. There's actually a really interesting part of the Genesis commentary I was looking at the other day, and I quoted it in my scripture book that will be coming out. And Luther is kind of tongue-in-cheek defending a medieval heresy called the Anthropomorphites. And the Anthropomorphites taught that, God must have a beard and sit on a throne and have hands and things like this. And Luther sort of tongue-in-cheek says, oh, well, that's defensible because when God comes to us, he wraps us up in a wrapper, okay? And then he says, well, pray at this wrapper, trust in this wrapper, and so forth. That's how you get to God, because we can't deal with God without some kind of covering, as he puts it. So he says when Adam and Eve would wake up in the morning, they would pray to the sun, because the sun exemplifies the glory of God, right? So they would adore the Creator in the creature, or as later Lutheran philosopher would say, God addresses creatures through creatures, right? So, anyways, so that's his attitude, and then we'll see that carries over to his view of the incarnation as well. So, again, a lot of the spiritualism stuff is very much inspired by, as we'll see, St. Augustine, and his conception of the Word as a signifier, a sound symbol that points beyond itself to something beyond it. Whereas for Luther, the Word, as we've already seen, enacts the reality. It contains the divine reality, enacts the reality for which it speaks. So, let there be light, right? And then thirdly, he establishes what later Lutherans in the second generation are going to call adiaphora. Adiaphora is a term that Lutherans took over from Stoic philosophy, and it just means things that are indifferent. So there's things that are good, and then there's things that are bad, and then there is, do you like Twinkies or not? There's nothing morally charged about whether you like Twinkies, right? And the Bible doesn't prohibit you from eating Twinkies, so it's fine, right? So Luther says, not that if the Bible doesn't say we directly Luther rejects the kind of regulative theory, and he says, the Bible doesn't have to explicitly tell us that we can do it for us to be able to do it. It just doesn't have to condemn it, okay? So things in the Bible says we should do, there's things that we definitely shouldn't do, and then everything else is a matter of Christian freedom. So it's a matter of freedom, whereas the Reformed tradition tends to go the direction of, oh my God, I'm so terrified that God is going to get me if I do one tiny thing that, maybe he doesn't explicitly affirm. So it's mainly, again, this sort of legalistic fear in the Reformed tradition, right? In any case, so he says we should ask the question, if something is indifferent, is it edifying or isn't it? We shouldn't ask the question, does it explicitly have a mandate in God's Word? The liturgy is a positive good, not because it's specifically commanded to have a specific liturgy, but because it promotes word and sacrament ministry. Okay. Same thing with maybe pictures of the saints or Jesus or something like that. Maybe there's some context where you wouldn't want to do that. Maybe if you go to an African culture where there's polytheism, okay, maybe you wouldn't want to do that, but that's for practical reasons, right? You can see this in Paul too. Paul is real clear that Galatians shouldn't get circumcised when they're being pressed to do it, because again, some second generation Lutherans will say, well, if the Catholics want us to just do ceremonies, which will help us fit in with them, then maybe we should do it, because again, there are things of a difference, so that we can escape persecution. And other Lutherans, led by Flacius, who was a Croatian theologian, who showed up in Wittenberg a little bit later, said, no, what does Paul say? I mean, he says in Romans, circumcision or uncircumcision is fine and dandy, but then in Galatians he says, if you get circumcised, if you don't testify to the Christian freedom which you have, then you're in big trouble, okay? So maybe in a context where you're called upon to confess your Christian freedom, or maybe like Paul's talking about at the end of Romans, where he's talking about food issues between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. In that case, maybe you would want to show some sensitivity in the way that, if we were in an African context and where people had come out of polytheism, or if you had people coming out of Islam and they had real problems with images in your churches, maybe then you wouldn't want to do it. Maybe you wouldn't want to do the equivalent of what Paul talks about, eating meat sacrificed to idols in front of weaker brethren or something like that. Okay, but in the end, the principle of adiaphora holds. So just because the medieval church did it, doesn't mean we have to scream, it's too Catholic, and not do it, right? So, because we have Christian freedom. So those are a series of really important distinctions which he then ends up setting up in those books against the heavenly prophets. And there are areas where Lutherans will be very much different from the Reformed tradition. Actually, Anglicans will follow Lutherans on a lot of those points as well, and so that will set up a lot of fighting between the Puritans and then the people who are the Orthodox members of the Anglican Church, since there's 39 articles will come down on the Lutheran side on these particular issues. So far so good. Any questions?
The Spirit only comes through the Word.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to phrase this, but if one would pray that the Holy Spirit would keep you in the Word, and again, to understand the Word correctly, that would not be an invalid prayer, would it?
No, because you're being then drawn to the source of the Word, right? And you can only pray that prayer because the Spirit has already come upon you through
That's
the Word.
right.
So,
Yeah.
or through the waters of baptism, which also contains the Word. So, yes.
And those sermons Luther does, they're the Invocata sermons, right? Is that the ones when he...
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. They are like the most kind of gentle sermons in a way of Luther's, because he sort of invites people to see why you would do the practices you do. And anyway, it's a real case of beautiful pastoral care.
Yes, and he doesn't force things on people. He teaches them, and he gradually changes everything. So now, gradually, we're not going to have a Latin Mass, but he doesn't want to get rid of the Latin Mass entirely. There's some university towns because he thinks it helps people learn their Latin. And, if people, for example, when he dissolves the monasteries, if people want to stay in the monastery and remain, celibate, then he's okay with that. He's not going to force them to, as we'll see, Zwingli then forces people to get married. So, in fact, he chooses people, and then they forcibly marries them and says, go be a productive citizen and make babies for Zurich, right? So, but, which, of course, since they've been systematically trained to be celibate, of course, they have a hard time bringing themselves to do so. Right? But anyways.
And would you guess that the difference between Roman Catholic practice on their clergy largely being celibate and Lutherans largely being married, you could trace the difference between Luther and Augustine and how Luther went and got married and Augustine?
Well, I think that there's an ethos in the early church that comes out of their interaction with the Hellenistic environment. In fact, there's a kind of a atheistic anarchist guy named Michel Foucault, who wrote a postmodern philosopher, wrote a history of sexuality. If you sit down and read the sections on Greek and Roman concepts of sexuality, that they absorbed almost entirely, the church fathers absorbed completely the Greco-Roman views of sexuality. So the philosophical ideal is, in Greek philosophy and ethics, the ideal is Typically in Stoicism is apatheia, so being desireless, or redirecting desire to spiritual things, right? And so early Christians pick up on this, and then they get a mania also for both celibacy and also dying in martyrdom, because again, desire for sex and fear of death are the two greatest desires, right? So if you can master those, then, you know, you're living the Christian life, because the Christian life now becomes identical with mastering passion in this conception. So, and this of course carries over then into Catholicism,